There is a place on Earth where doctors have always assumed the human body simply cannot live. Not for a season, not permanently. The air there holds barely half the oxygen your lungs are used to. And yet, on a mountainside, beneath a glacier, the locals call the Sleeping Beauty, roughly 30,000 people are waking up this morning in exactly that place. Boiling water that never quite reaches a full boil. Breathing air that never quite fills their lungs. Doing it again the way they have done every single day for years. Let's take a closer look. In the southern Peruvian Andes, in the Puno region near the Bolivian border, a glacier locals call La Bella Durmiente, the Sleeping Beauty, rises above the Altiplano, its ice fields catching the thin, brilliant light of an altitude where the sky itself looks different, deeper blue, closer somehow. At the foot of that glacier, clinging to a slope so steep that streets barely qualify as streets, sits a town that should not, by almost any conventional understanding of human physiology, be able to sustain a permanent population at all. Its name is La Rinconada, and it sits at roughly 500 meters above sea level, nearly 3.5 miles into the sky, high enough that the air here carries only about half the oxygen available at sea level. For most of the 20th century, this was not a town at all, but a seasonal mining camp, occupied only when gold prospectors made the difficult climb up from the valley, worked whatever claim they could find, and came back down before the altitude. The cold, or simple bad luck, took its toll. What changed everything was not a discovery. The gold here had been known for decades. What changed was price. Between 2001 and 2009, the global price of gold rose by more than 200%, and word of that rise reached exactly the kind of communities across the Andes and beyond, for whom a single successful season in the mines could mean more money than a decade of work anywhere else. Families began arriving behind the miners, then families began staying. A camp that housed perhaps a few hundred transient workers at the turn of the millennium became, within less than a decade, a genuine settlement, however informal, however precarious, home to tens of thousands of permanent residents, at an altitude no comparable population had ever sustained before. Today, depending on which count you believe, somewhere between 30 and 70,000 people live in La Rinconada. The town's own informality is part of why nobody, not even the Peruvian government, can state the number with real confidence. What is certain is this: it is, by any accepted definition, the highest permanent human settlement anywhere on the surface of this planet. Every day in La Rinconada begins with a fact that residents elsewhere would never have to think about. At this altitude, water boils at a lower temperature, which means cooking itself takes longer, and rice or potatoes that would be ready in 20 minutes at sea level can take closer to an hour here. It is a small, almost trivial detail, and yet it captures something true about daily life in this town. Nearly everything that would be simple anywhere else requires more time, more effort, more of the body's limited reserves. The town itself sprawls up the mountainside in a dense, largely unplanned tangle of corrugated tin roofing, narrow unpaved paths standing in for streets, and buildings stacked close against one another for whatever shelter that proximity can offer against the wind. There is no functioning sewage system across most of the settlement. Running water is scarce, and, where it exists at all, frequently contaminated by the same mining runoff that has made the nearby glacier itself a source of concern for researchers studying mercury contamination in the region's water supply. And yet, beneath all of that hardship, the ordinary rhythms of a town continue. Markets open each morning, selling everything from fresh produce hauled up from the valley to mining equipment to religious candles for the shrines that dot the settlement. Children attend the town's small number of schools. Music plays from shop radios. It is, in its own compressed and difficult way, a functioning community, one that simply happens to exist at an altitude that, by most scientific consensus, before La Rinconada's growth, should not have supported permanent human life at all. For the men who work the mines themselves, and by long tradition here, only men are permitted underground, each day means a climb of 30 minutes or more simply to reach the tunnel entrance, followed by hours of physical labor in air so thin that even standing still can leave a newcomer gasping. They do it not for a wage in the conventional sense, but for something far less certain. The economic system that governs almost all mining labor in La Rinconada is called cachorreo, and it is, even by the standards of informal economies elsewhere in the world, an extraordinary arrangement. Under this system, a miner works for 30 consecutive days without receiving any wage at all. On the 31st day, and only that day, he is permitted to keep whatever gold-bearing rock he personally can carry out of the mine on his own back. It sounds, described plainly, almost impossible to agree to. And yet thousands of men climb into these tunnels every single month under exactly these terms. To understand why, you have to understand what happens on that 31st day when luck genuinely turns. Because when it does not turn a little. A single exceptional day of cachorreo, on rare occasions, has been known to yield a miner more raw gold than he could earn in years of conventional wage labor anywhere else available to him. It is, in every sense, a gamble, one weighted overwhelmingly against the worker, structured to ensure that the mine's owners bear almost none of the financial risk of a bad month, while the miners themselves absorb nearly all of it. But for men, arriving from some of the poorest rural regions of Peru and neighboring countries, with genuinely few alternative paths to significant income, the arithmetic of an occasional life-changing day has proven, for 2 decades running, more compelling than the near certainty of 30 unpaid days that precede it. It is this single economic mechanism, more than any other factor, that explains almost everything else about La Rinconada. Why the population grew so explosively when gold prices rose. Why families followed the miners rather than waiting for them to return. And why, even as the difficulty of life here has become increasingly well documented, the town has continued to grow rather than empty out. Because the promise of cachorreo has drawn so many people to sustained life at an altitude the human body was never designed for, Because of that, La Rinconada has become something of an unplanned, unintended case study in the outer limits of human physiological adaptation. Researchers who have studied miners living for years above 5,000 meters have documented a cluster of overlapping conditions rarely seen concentrated in a single population anywhere else. Chronic mountain sickness, in which the body's blood thickens with excess red cells straining to carry sufficient oxygen. Lung damage from the fine silica dust inherent to the mining work itself. And in many cases, neurological effects linked to mercury still used informally in the gold extraction process despite its well-documented toxicity. Because of that combination of altitude, labor, and informal industrial practice, life expectancy figures cited for La Rinconada's miners run dramatically below the Peruvian national average. Commonly cited in the range of 30 to 35 years for men who spend their working lives in the tunnels, though precise figures are difficult to verify given the town's informal record-keeping. The settlement has, to date, only a single small medical clinic to serve a population that may number in the tens of thousands. And in that clinic's limited records, doctors researching the town's health crisis noticed something they had not expected to find. It isn't only the miners whose bodies showed signs of the mountain's toll. It was almost everyone in town, including children who had never once set foot underground. And the reason why says as much about what this town has become as anything happening inside the mine itself. Because of the informal and largely unregulated nature of gold processing in the area, mercury used to separate gold from ore, then often disposed of without any meaningful containment. Contamination has spread well beyond the mine itself, into the water, the soil, and eventually into the bodies of residents who never chose mining as a livelihood at all. Because of that same lack of formal governance, La Rinconada has also struggled across 2 decades of rapid growth with elevated rates of crime and, according to documented reporting, exploitation targeting some of the town's most vulnerable residents. The reason the settlement has, in Spanish-language media, sometimes been described bluntly as the lawless city of Peru. In 2024, Peruvian authorities began a modest effort to install additional security infrastructure in the town, though residents and researchers alike have noted that such measures have so far focused more on protecting the gold itself than on addressing the underlying hardships of the people who extract it. And yet, for every account of La Rinconada's hardship, and there are many, thoroughly documented by researchers, journalists, and the Peruvian government itself, there remain tens of thousands of people who have built, deliberately, and often across multiple generations now, an actual life on this mountainside, rather than a temporary stopover on the way to somewhere easier. Families here maintain small shops, run informal transport between La Rinconada and the valley towns below, raise children who attend the settlement schools, and in growing numbers, leave for further education elsewhere while their parents remain. Religious life is visible everywhere in the town. Small shrines, candles, and images tucked into storefronts and doorways, a quiet, constant thread of faith running through a place that offers its residents very few other guarantees. Successful miners, when their luck holds long enough, will often maintain a second home in Juliaca or another lower-altitude city, a place where running water functions normally and the air holds oxygen the body doesn't have to fight for. while continuing to work the mines above. It is a pattern that reveals something important about how residents themselves understand this place. Not necessarily as a permanent home in the sentimental sense, but as an economic proposition endured year after year for the sake of a future built somewhere else. And yet, for the majority who never accumulate enough to leave, La Rinconada becomes, gradually and by circumstance rather than romantic choice, exactly that permanent home anyway. And since the gold price surge of the early 2000s first drew families up this mountainside in numbers nobody had anticipated, La Rinconada has continued to exist. Not comfortably, not by any measure a public health official would call sustainable, but continuously, stubbornly, for more than 2 decades now. It remains today a place, largely, without the infrastructure that even modest towns elsewhere take for granted. No comprehensive sewage system, limited and often contaminated water access, a single small clinic for a population that may exceed 60,000 people, depending on the count. And yet, it also remains unmistakably a town with markets, homes, families, faith, and an economy that, however brutal its underlying mechanics, continues to draw new arrivals every year, climbing the same steep paths for the same uncertain promise that drew the first prospectors here generations ago. Scientists continue to study La Rinconada's population less as a cautionary tale than as a genuine anomaly. A community that has, in effect, forced medical researchers to revise their assumptions about the outer boundary of where and how permanently the human body can adapt. Every rule that governs life in La Rinconada was written by the mountain itself. But one of the oldest rules was written by belief that the glacier they call La Bella Durmiente has a feminine spirit, and that she grows dangerous if another woman enters her domain. As a direct consequence, women are barred from working inside the mine shafts. What this has produced instead is a second, entirely separate economy, built by the women the tunnels exclude. They are called palaqueras, and their work begins on the surface, clambering over loose, unstable rock piles to sort through what the miners have already discarded. A good week might yield a palaquera 1 or 2 grams of gold. A bad week yields nothing at all. Before climbing, many follow a ritual as old as the work itself, chewing coca leaves and leaving 2 cigarettes burning as an offering to the mountain, asking a portion of good fortune from a place that has already excluded them. What happens to that gold after it leaves La Rinconada follows a path that most of the people who extract it will never see. Small buyers purchase the raw gold at prices well below international rates. From there, it moves upward through a chain of regional brokers and trading houses until it eventually reaches formal refineries. Although Peruvian law technically requires documentation proving a mineral's legal origin, gold, extracted under these unregulated conditions, continues to enter the formal global market largely undetected, its informal origins effectively laundered by the time it reaches jewelry cases and electronics factories on the other side of the world. A formal government program meant to formalize these miners has largely failed. Of more than 60,000 informal miners registered nationwide, fewer than 3,000 have ever completed the full process. The economic logic underneath it all is brutally simple. Global demand for gold has never meaningfully asked where a given gram was extracted or at what cost to the person who found it. Walk the main street on any given evening, and the dark economy built on top of the mining becomes visible. An illegal sex trade draws women trafficked from poorer regions of Peru and Bolivia, operating unchecked due to a large transient male population and a weak local government. Yet alongside that darker reality, an entirely ordinary economy continues as well. Barbershops, small restaurants, and modest schools where families are simply trying to build a life. This is the true chain of La Rinconada, stretching from a Palaquera's rock pile into the global market, carrying with it, invisibly, every single human cost. It would be simple enough to tell the story of La Rinconada as a story about altitude, about lungs and blood and the outer edge of what a human body can physically endure. That story is true, but it is not, in the end, the reason tens of thousands of people continue to climb this mountain and stay. The real story here is the same one that quietly explains hard, unlikely places all over the world. Given a genuine chance, however narrow, however brutally weighted against them, people will climb higher than doctors thought possible, breathe air that should not sustain them, and build something resembling an ordinary life. Markets, homes, shrines, a school day, a boiled pot of rice that simply takes a little longer, for the sake of a future that gold, and only gold, seem to make even remotely reachable. La Rinconada does not exist because the mountain welcomed anyone. It exists because the world outside offered so many people no better place to go. If you find meaning in these forgotten coordinates, consider subscribing to the map. Together, we'll keep rescuing these places from the silence of history.